I won't leave you, Mr. Blackwood. Not now. The words cut through the acrid smoke like a blade through leather, and James Blackwood's soot-stained face twisted with something between anguish and rage. Behind them, the skeletal remains of what had once been the grandest ranch house in Wyoming territory crackled and hissed, sending orange sparks dancing against the star-drunk sky. "Don't you understand, girl?" His voice was hoarse from breathing smoke and shouting orders to save what little they could. "There's nothing left. Nothing." He gestured wildly at the smoldering ruins, his calloused hands trembling. "I can't pay you. Hell, I can't even feed myself now." Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. The young woman standing before him didn't flinch, though tears had carved clean tracks through the ash on her cheeks. Her simple servant's dress was singed and torn. Her auburn hair escaped from its pins and wound around her shoulders, but her green eyes held a determination that made him step back. "Then we'll rebuild," she said quietly, and the certainty in her voice made his chest tighten with something he couldn't name. "We?" The word came out as a bitter laugh. "There is no we, Miss Catherine. There never was. You were my housekeeper, nothing more, and now—" He spread his arms wide, encompassing the devastation that had once been his empire. "Now there's no house to keep." Something flickered across her face then, hurt perhaps, or disappointment, but it was gone so quickly he might have imagined it. She lifted her chin in that stubborn way he'd come to know too well over the past 6 months. The gesture that had both infuriated and secretly delighted him since the day she'd first knocked on his door. "You're wrong about that, Mr. Blackwood." Her voice was steady, but he caught the slight tremor beneath it. "You're wrong about a great many things." The way she said it made his blood run cold, as if she were holding back secrets that could change everything, as if the prim, proper housekeeper he thought he knew was someone else entirely. What the hell is that supposed to mean? But she was already turning away, her skirt swashing as she walked toward what remained of the stable, where their 2 surviving horses stamped nervously in the cooling night air. Over her shoulder, she called back words that would haunt him until dawn. "Ask me again when you're ready to hear the truth. Some secrets are worth keeping, but others will burn you alive if you hold them too long." 6 months earlier, James Blackwood had been the kind of man who made other men step aside when he walked down the main street of Redemption Falls. 6 feet of lean muscle wrapped in expensive leather and fine wool, with steel gray eyes that could freeze a rattlesnake at 20 paces, and a jaw carved from Wyoming granite. The Blackwood Ranch sprawled across 15,000 acres of prime grazing land, his cattle bearing the Double B brand that meant quality from Montana to Texas. But success had a way of making a man lonely, and James Blackwood was the loneliest soul in the territory. He'd built his empire with his own 2 hands after returning from the war, channeling his grief and rage into something productive. Every board in his grand ranch house, every fence post on his property, every head of cattle in his herds, all of it bought and paid for with blood, sweat, and a determination to prove that a Confederate soldier's son could make something of himself in this unforgiving land. The problem with building walls around your heart was that eventually you forgot how to tear them down. That's why he'd been standing on his front porch that October morning, scowling at the endless blue sky and wondering why his coffee tasted like ash, when the stagecoach had rumbled up his drive in a cloud of dust and horse sweat. The woman who stepped down from that coach was nothing like what he'd been expecting. He'd advertised for a housekeeper in the territorial newspapers, someone sturdy and sensible, preferably middle-aged and uninterested in romantic complications. What he got instead was a slip of a girl who couldn't have been more than 22, with hair the color of autumn leaves and eyes like spring grass after rain. "Mr. Blackwood?" Her voice carried the cultured tones of the East, all soft vowels and proper pronunciation that marked her as educated. She wore a simple gray traveling dress that had seen better days, but she carried herself like royalty. "I'm Catherine Wells. I believe you're expecting me." He wasn't expecting her at all. The woman who'd answered his advertisement had been named Mrs. Catherine Wells, a widow he'd assumed, with the experience and no-nonsense attitude he had hoped for. This girl looked like she'd never scrubbed a floor in her life. "There's been some mistake," he said, not bothering to come down from the porch. "I hired a housekeeper, not a governess." Her chin lifted in that way he'd come to know too well. "I am your housekeeper, Madame Blackwood, and I assure you there's been no mistake. You're just a girl. I'm 23 years old, and I've been managing households since I was 16. There was steel beneath the silk in her voice. "If you'd prefer to interview other candidates, I understand. But I've come a very long way, and I'd appreciate the chance to prove myself before you send me away." Something in her tone made him look closer. Beneath the refined accent and proper posture, he caught a glimpse of desperation carefully controlled. She needed this job, needed it badly enough to travel alone across half the country to a place where most women wouldn't dare venture. Against his better judgment, he found himself curious. "Fine," he said, finally stepping down from the porch. "1 week. You can prove yourself for 1 week and then we'll see." The smile that lit up her face was like sunrise over the mountains, and James Blackwood felt something shift in his chest that he'd thought was dead and buried. He should have known right then that Catherine Wells was going to be trouble. A woman's hands can tell you more about her story than her words ever will. Within 3 days, James realized he'd made either the best decision of his life or the worst mistake possible. Catherine Wells was a mystery wrapped in an enigma and tied up with secrets. But damn if she wasn't the finest housekeeper he'd ever employed. His ranch house had never been cleaner, his meals had never been more delicious, and somehow she'd managed to organize his chaotic existence with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. But it was the little things that made him suspicious. The way she held her coffee cup with her pinky extended, like she'd been trained in proper etiquette from birth. The way she could identify the quality of his imported brandy with a single sip. The way she read his leather-bound books in the evenings when she thought he wasn't looking. Her lips moving silently as she worked through complex philosophical passages that would have challenged a university professor. Most telling of all were her hands. Oh, they were working hands now, reddened from washing dishes, slightly roughened from scrubbing floors and beating rugs. But beneath the new calluses, he could see evidence of a different life. Her palms were too soft, her fingers too slender and graceful. These were hands that had held delicate china, not cast iron skillets. Hands that had worn silk gloves, not work-worn cotton. "Where exactly did you work before coming here?" he asked one evening as she served his dinner. It was a simple question, but he watched her carefully as she answered. "Back east," she said, which wasn't really an answer at all. "I have references if you'd like to see them." "I'd like to see them." She hesitated for just a moment. So briefly he might have missed it if he hadn't been watching. Before nodding. "Of course, I'll fetch them after I finish cleaning up." The references, when she produced them, were impeccable. 3 different families in Pennsylvania, all singing the praises of Miss Catherine Wells and her excellent housekeeping skills. The letterhead was expensive, the handwriting elegant, the recommendations glowing. James had served in the war. He'd learned to spot forgeries and half-truths, and something about these letters made his instincts prickle. They were too perfect, too similar in their phrasing, as if they'd all been written by the same person. "These families," he said, handing the letters back to her, "they must have been sorry to lose you." "Yes, sir, I believe they were. Yet they let you go." This time the hesitation was longer, and he saw her fingers tighten on the papers. The youngest daughter married and moved away. They no longer needed a housekeeper. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. It was also, he was almost certain, a complete lie. But watching her face in the lamplight, the way her green eyes flickered with something that might have been fear, he found himself unwilling to press the matter. Whatever secrets Catherine Wells was hiding, she was hiding them for a reason. And despite his naturally suspicious nature, he was beginning to care more about keeping her safe than learning her truth. "Well," he said finally, "you're here now. That's what matters." The relief that crossed her features was so profound it made his chest ache. After that night, he stopped asking questions about her past and started paying attention to her present. He noticed how she always rose before dawn to start the coffee, how she hummed softly while she worked, how she saved scraps for the barn cats without being asked. He noticed how she never complained, never shirked her duties, never asked for anything beyond her modest wages and basic room and board. He also noticed how she looked at him sometimes when she thought he wasn't watching, with a combination of curiosity and something that might have been longing, as if she were trying to solve a puzzle that mattered more than it should. The feeling was mutual. James Blackwood had spent the last 5 years telling himself he did not need anyone, that solitude was safer than companionship, that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. But Catherine Wells was making him question everything he thought he knew about what he wanted. The way she laughed at his dry humor, the way she listened when he talked about his plans for expanding the ranch, the way she never flinched when he was in one of his dark moods, never tried to fix him or change him, just quietly went about her business until the storm passed. She was everything he hadn't known he was looking for, and absolutely nothing he should want. Because whatever else Catherine Wells might be, she sure as hell wasn't just a housekeeper looking for honest work. The question was, what was she really running from? And the more troubling question, what would he do when her past finally caught up with her? 3 weeks into her employment, he got his first hint of an answer when he found her in the study late one night, standing in front of his bookshelf with tears streaming down her face. She was holding a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, one of his favorites, and staring at it like it held the secrets of the universe. "Catherine?" His voice was gentle, but she startled anyway, nearly dropping the book. "What's wrong?" "Nothing," she said quickly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood. I shouldn't have. I know the books are private." "The books are there to be read," he said, moving closer. "But that doesn't explain why reading them made you cry." For a moment he thought she might tell him. Her lips parted, and he saw the words hovering there, just waiting to be spoken. But then she shook her head and carefully returned the book to its place on the shelf. "It's late," she said. "I should get to bed." She started to walk past him, but he caught her arm gently, stopping her in the doorway. "Catherine." The sound of her name on his lips was softer than he'd intended. "Whatever it is you were running from, whatever brought you here, you're safe now." The smile she gave him was heartbreaking in its sadness. "Am I, Mr. Blackwood? Are any of us ever really safe?" And with that cryptic question hanging in the air between them, she slipped away into the darkness, leaving him alone with more questions than ever. Something told him he was going to need those answers sooner than he'd like. The truth has a way of revealing itself, whether you're ready for it or not. November brought the first real snow to the Wyoming Territory, blanketing the Blackwood Ranch in pristine white that made everything look clean and new. But beneath that beautiful surface, James could feel something shifting, like the moment before an avalanche when the mountain holds its breath. Catherine had been with him for nearly 2 months now, and their careful dance around each other was beginning to wear thin. Every day brought small moments of connection that felt too significant to ignore. The way she automatically poured his coffee exactly how he liked it, the way he found himself timing his evening walks to coincide with her finishing the kitchen work, the way they'd started sitting by the fire together in comfortable silence. But it was the letter that changed everything. James found it quite by accident when he was looking for his property deed in his desk drawer. The envelope was cream-colored and expensive, addressed to Miss Catherine Whitmore in elegant script, with a return address from Philadelphia that made his blood run cold. Whitmore and Associates, legal counsel. Catherine Wells wasn't her real name. He stared at the letter for a long moment, his conscience warring with his curiosity. Reading someone else's mail was a violation of privacy that went against everything he'd been taught about honor and decency. But something about the formal, legal letterhead and the way it had been hidden in his desk made his soldier's instincts scream that this was important. Before he could talk himself out of it, he opened it. "Miss Whitmore. This letter serves as final notice regarding your father's estate. As you are well aware, the creditors have been most patient, but their patience is not infinite. If you do not return to Philadelphia within 30 days to settle the outstanding debts, they will be forced to pursue alternative means of collection. Your uncle has made it clear that his previous offer of assistance remains contingent upon your agreement to the marriage contract with Mr. Aldrich Covington. Given the circumstances, I strongly advise you to consider this option most seriously." The estate's debts now total nearly $40,000. Without intervention, you will face criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement by Christmas. Please contact this office at your earliest convenience. Respectfully, Harrison Whitmore III. James read the letter 3 times before its full implications sank in. Catherine, or whoever she really was, wasn't just running from an unhappy past. She was running from fraud charges and a forced marriage, with debts that would take a lifetime to repay. $40,000. Christ, that was more money than most people saw in a lifetime. And her uncle was trying to sell her off to pay for it. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. The refined manners, the expensive tastes, the quality of her forged references. She wasn't a servant at all. She was gentry, fallen on hard times and desperate enough to disappear completely rather than submit to an arranged marriage. The question was, what the hell was he supposed to do about it? His first instinct was anger. She'd lied to him, deceived him, put his ranch at risk by bringing her troubles to his doorstep. If someone came looking for her, if this Aldrich Covington or the lawyers or the creditors tracked her here, they could destroy everything he'd built. His second instinct was protectiveness so fierce it surprised him. The thought of anyone forcing Catherine into marriage, of her facing criminal charges for debts that probably weren't even her fault, made him want to reach for his gun. By the time she returned from the henhouse with a basket of eggs, he'd made his decision. "We need to talk," he said, holding up the letter. The color drained from her face so quickly he thought she might faint. The basket of eggs slipped from her nerveless fingers, crashing to the floor in a mess of shells and yolk that neither of them bothered to clean up. "You read my mail." Her voice was barely a whisper. "I found it in my desk. Hidden." He kept his tone carefully neutral, watching as she sank into a chair like her legs wouldn't hold her anymore. "Care to explain how it got there?" She was quiet for so long, he wasn't sure she was going to answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than he'd expected. "I needed somewhere safe to keep it, somewhere I could find it when I was ready to face what it said." "And what does it say, Catherine? Or should I call you Miss Whitmore?" A bitter laugh escaped her lips. "Catherine Elizabeth Whitmore, daughter of the late Senator Charles Whitmore of Pennsylvania, granddaughter of railroad money and old Philadelphia society." She looked up at him with eyes that held decades of pain despite her young age. "Everything my father didn't steal, he gambled away. Everything he gambled away, he borrowed against. When he died last spring, he left me with nothing but debts and a reputation in ruins." "So you ran." "So I ran." She stood abruptly, moving to the window to stare out at the snow-covered fields. "My uncle offered to pay the debts if I married Aldrich Covington. A business arrangement, he called it. Aldrich needed a wife with the right bloodline to advance his political career, and I needed someone to save me from debtor's prison." "But you refused." "I met Aldrich." Her voice held a note of revulsion that made James's hands clench into fists. "He's not a kind man, Mr. Blackwood. He made it very clear what kind of wife he expected, and it had nothing to do with love or respect or partnership. I would have been little more than a well-dressed servant, expected to produce heirs and stay silent about everything else. So you became an actual servant instead." She turned to face him then, and the pride in her bearing reminded him that whatever else she might be, Catherine Whitmore was nobody's victim. "I chose my own servitude," she said simply, "and I chose who I served." The weight of those words hung between them like a bridge neither was ready to cross. James found himself studying her face, memorizing the way the afternoon light caught the gold in her hair, the stubborn set of her jaw, the defiant tilt of her chin that he was beginning to realize was pure aristocratic breeding. "They'll come looking for you," he said finally. "Yes." "It could mean trouble for me, for the ranch." "Yes." "I should send you away, right now, tonight, before they show up here." Her composure finally cracked, just a little. "Yes," she whispered, "you should." But even as he said the words, James knew he wouldn't do it, couldn't do it, because somewhere in the last 2 months, this proud, stubborn, secretive woman had become more important to him than his own safety, which was exactly the kind of thinking that got a man killed in the Wyoming Territory. Some women are worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against you. You're not going anywhere. The words were out of James's mouth before he'd consciously decided to say them, but once they hung in the air between them, he realized he meant every syllable. Catherine's green eyes widened with something that might have been hope, quickly followed by something that was definitely fear. Mr. Blackwood, you don't understand what you're saying. These people, they have resources, connections. They could destroy you without breaking stride. Let them try to. He moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to cling to her hair. I didn't build this ranch by backing down from a fight. This isn't your fight. The hell it isn't. His voice was rougher than he'd intended, but he was past caring about maintaining proper distance. You think I'm going to stand by and watch them drag you back to marry some bastard who'll treat you like property? You think I'm that kind of man? She stared at him for a long moment, and he could practically see the thoughts racing behind her eyes. Hope warring with practicality, desire fighting with self-preservation. What are you suggesting? She asked finally. I'm suggesting we get married. The words surprised him as much as they did her. He'd been thinking about protection, about legal complications, about the best way to keep her safe from her uncle's schemes. But the moment he said it, he realized it was more than that. Much more. Married? Catherine's voice was barely a whisper. It's a common enough arrangement out here, he said, trying to keep his tone businesslike, even as his heart hammered against his ribs. Marriage of convenience. You would have my name, my protection. They couldn't force you into anything else as long as you were legally my wife. And what would you get out of it? The question hung between them like a challenge. He could have said practical things. A permanent housekeeper, someone to help manage the ranch, the respectability that came with being a married man. All of those would have been true. Instead, he found himself being more honest than he'd been with anyone in years. I'd get you, he said simply. And maybe that's selfish, but I stopped pretending to be a saint a long time ago. Color flooded her cheeks, and for a moment she looked like the sheltered society girl she'd once been, instead of the capable woman she'd become. James, it was the first time she'd ever used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips made something inside his chest turn over. Think about it, he said, stepping back before he did something foolish like try to kiss her. We work well together. We care about each other. I've seen how you look at this place, Catherine. You love it here as much as I do. I do, she admitted softly. But marriage it's permanent, binding. What if you meet someone else? Someone without all this baggage and trouble? I won't. You can't know that. I can. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, feeling her tremble under his palm. I've been alone for a long time, Catherine. I thought that's how I wanted it. But these past 2 months with you, I can't imagine going back to that emptiness. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she didn't pull away from his touch. You barely know me. The real me. I know enough. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, marveling at the softness of her skin. I know you're brave enough to run away from everything you've ever known, rather than submit to a life you don't want. I know you're strong enough to start over with nothing but the clothes on your back. I know you're kind to animals and generous with the ranch hands, and you hum while you work because you find joy even in the simplest tasks. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. James, and I know, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, that I've been falling in love with you since the day you stepped off that stagecoach and told me there'd been no mistake. Her breath caught, and when she opened her eyes, they were bright with tears. You don't mean that. I've never meant anything more in my life. For a heartbeat, he thought she might say yes, might step into his arms and let him chase away all the fear and uncertainty that had been driving her for months. But then she pulled back, wrapping her arms around herself like armor. I need time to think, she said. How much time? I don't know. It's a lot to consider. He nodded, even though every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to press his advantage, to convince her with kisses and promises until she couldn't think of any reason to refuse. But Catherine Whitmore had had enough of men trying to force her into decisions. If she was going to marry him, It had to be her choice. Take all the time you need, he said. But Catherine? Yes? Whatever you decide, I meant what I said earlier. You're not going anywhere. Married or not, I'll protect you from them. The smile she gave him was tremulous but real. Why would you do that for me? Because, he said, moving toward the door before his self-control finally snapped. Some things are worth fighting for. He left her standing by the window, silhouetted against the snow-covered landscape like a figure from a painting. As he walked away, he caught himself calculating distances to town, thinking about how long it would take to get a preacher out to the ranch if she said yes. He also found himself listening for the sound of hoofbeats on the wind, wondering how much time they had before her past caught up with them. One way or another, he had a feeling they were about to find out. Love is a luxury you can't afford until you realize it's the only thing worth having. Catherine didn't give him an answer that night, or the next day, or the day after that. But James could see the struggle in her eyes every time she looked at him. Want warring with fear, hope battling against hard-learned caution. He didn't press her for a decision, but he did make preparations. First, he rode into Redemption Falls and had a long conversation with Sheriff Morrison about the legal complexities of extradition and the rights of married women under territorial law. Then he stopped by the bank and moved most of his liquid assets to accounts that would be harder to freeze or seize. Finally, he visited the town's only lawyer and made sure his will was updated and properly witnessed. If Catherine's past was coming for her, he intended to be ready. The answer to how much time they had came 3 days later, in the form of dust clouds on the horizon and the thunder of approaching horses. James was in the barn checking on a mare who'd been favoring her left leg when Catherine burst through the doors, her face pale with panic. "They're here," she gasped. "3 men, riding hard from the east. I think one of them is Aldrich." James dropped the horse's hoof and reached for the rifle he kept mounted on the barn wall. "How long?" "Maybe 10 minutes if they maintain their pace." "All right." His mind was already racing through possibilities, calculating angles and advantages. "Go to the house. Pack only what you can't live without. Documents, personal items, nothing heavy. If this goes badly, you'll need to be ready to run." "James, no." She caught his arm as he started for the door. "I won't let you fight my battles for me. This stopped being just your battle the moment I decided I loved you," he said firmly. "Now go, please." For a moment, she looked like she might argue further. Then she stood on her toes and pressed a quick, fierce kiss to his lips. "If we survive this," she whispered against his mouth. "My answer is yes." Before he could respond, she was gone. Running toward the house with her skirts billowing behind her, James touched his lips where she'd kissed him, feeling something settle into place in his chest like the final piece of a puzzle. Then he checked his rifle and walked out to meet whatever was coming. The 3 riders who approached his ranch house were everything he'd expected, and worse. The man in the lead was tall and thin, with the soft look of someone who'd never done an honest day's work in his life. His clothes were expensive but impractical for riding, more suited to drawing rooms than Wyoming territory. This had to be Aldrich Covington. The other 2 were clearly hired muscle, hard-faced men with the kind of eyes that suggested they'd kill for money and sleep soundly afterward. James positioned himself on his front porch, rifle held casually but ready, and waited for them to close the distance. "You'd be James Blackwood," Aldrich called out when they were close enough for conversation. His voice carried the nasal quality of old money and new arrogance. "This is my land," James reported evenly. "State your business." Aldrich dismounted with the careful movements of someone unaccustomed to horses, his 2 companions staying mounted and alert. "My business is with Miss Catherine Whitmore. I have reason to believe she's here." "Don't know anyone by that name." "Please, Mr. Blackwood, let's not play games." Aldrich brushed dust from his jacket with distaste. "I've tracked her from Philadelphia through 3 different territories. She's here, and I'm prepared to be quite generous in exchange for your cooperation." "And if I'm not interested in your generosity?" One of the hired guns shifted in his saddle, his hand moving closer to his weapon. James noticed the movement but didn't react to it. Yet. "I understand you've built quite an impressive operation here," Aldrich continued, his tone conversational but with an undertone of threat. It would be a shame if anything happened to disrupt it. Accidents occur so frequently in this lawless territory. Is that a threat? It's a business proposition. Aldrich smiled, but there was nothing pleasant about it. Catherine owes a considerable debt to some very influential people. They're prepared to forgive that debt in exchange for her immediate return to Philadelphia and her compliance with certain previously arranged agreements. And if she refuses, then she'll face the consequences of her father's crimes. Prison is no place for a delicate young woman, don't you think? James felt his jaw clench. What makes you think I know where she is? Because, Aldrich said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket, according to my sources, you recently hired a housekeeper named Catherine Wells, a woman matching Miss Whitmore's exact description, who arrived here shortly after disappearing from Philadelphia. The paper was a wanted poster, crude but recognizable likeness of Catherine, offering a reward for information leading to her whereabouts. Impressive detective work, James said. Must have cost you a pretty penny. Money well spent. Now, shall we discuss terms, or do we need to make this unpleasant? Before James could answer, the front door opened behind him, and Catherine stepped onto the porch. She'd changed into her best dress, a dark blue wool that brought out her eyes, and arranged her hair in an elegant style that reminded him powerfully of the aristocrat she'd been born to be. "Hello, Aldrich," she said calmly. "I see you found me." The change in Aldrich's demeanor was immediate and unsettling. His cold, businesslike facade melted away, replaced by something hungry and possessive that made James's skin crawl. "Catherine, my dear." Aldrich took a step forward, then stopped when James shifted his rifle slightly. "You've led us quite a chase, but you're safe now. We've come to take you home." "This is my home," Catherine replied, moving to stand beside James, with her chin raised in that defiant gesture he'd come to love. "Don't be ridiculous. This is a ranch in the middle of nowhere, hardly suitable for a woman of your breeding." "My breeding?" Catherine's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "My breeding is the only thing that makes me valuable to you, isn't it, Aldrich? Not my mind, not my heart, certainly not my wishes. Just my bloodline and what it can do for your political ambitions. You're upset, understandably so, but running away like a child won't solve your problems." "You're right," Catherine said quietly. "Running away won't solve them." James felt something cold settle in his stomach. There was something in her tone, something resigned and final that made him want to grab her and never let go. "Catherine," he said quietly, "what are you doing?" She turned to look at him, and the love in her eyes nearly brought him to his knees. "What I should have done months ago," she said. "I'm going to fight." The moment before a fight begins is when you discover who you really are. "I'm not going back with you, Aldrich." Catherine's voice rang clear across the ranch yard, carrying an authority that made even the hired guns straighten in their saddles. "Not now, not ever." "You don't have a choice in the matter," Aldrich replied, his mask of civility finally slipping to reveal the cold calculation beneath. "Your father's debts." "Were not my debts," Catherine interrupted firmly. "I've had months to research the law, and I know my rights. A daughter is not responsible for her father's financial crimes unless she was a willing participant. Which you were. Your signature is on dozens of bank documents. Forged signatures." Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. "I have handwriting experts who will testify that at least half of those documents were signed by someone else. Probably my dear uncle, who stood to inherit everything if I was declared complicit." James felt a surge of admiration for the woman beside him. This wasn't the desperate fugitive who'd arrived on his doorstep. This was Catherine Whitmore in all her aristocratic glory, armed with intelligence and breeding, and the kind of quiet fury that could topple governments. Aldrich's face darkened. "You can't prove that." "Can I?" Catherine reached into her skirt pocket and withdrew a folded document. "This is a sworn affidavit from my father's secretary detailing how you and my uncle pressured her into copying my handwriting. She was quite willing to talk once she learned you'd thrown her to the wolves to protect yourselves." "That's impossible. Margaret would never." "Margaret is safely in California with her sister, well beyond your reach, along with copies of every document she ever forged and a detailed confession of who ordered her to do it." The silence that followed was thick with tension. James could see Aldrich's mind working. calculating new angles, searching for leverage. Even if that's true, Aldrich said finally, it doesn't change the fact that you're still my fiancé. A betrothal contract was signed by my uncle without my consent after I'd already left Philadelphia. Catherine's eyes glittered with something dangerous, hardly legally binding under any jurisdiction. You're making this much more difficult than it needs to be, Catherine. I'm making it as difficult as it deserves to be. One of the hired guns, a scarred man with dead eyes, finally spoke up. Boss, we could just take her. 3 against 1 ain't bad odds. 2 against 1, Catherine corrected calmly. She reached into her other pocket and withdrew a small but deadly-looking derringer. I may be a lady, but I'm a Western lady now. James felt his heart skip. When the hell had she gotten a gun? And actually, Catherine continued conversationally, it's 3 against 3. From around the corner of the house stepped Miguel Santos, James's ranch foreman, carrying a shotgun with the casual ease of a man who knew how to use it. Behind him came Tom Bradley, the youngest of the ranch hands, armed with a rifle and wearing the grim expression of someone eager to prove himself. Herd horses, Miguel said by way of explanation. Thought the patron might need some help. James felt a fierce surge of gratitude for his men. Miguel had been with him since the beginning, a steady presence who could read cattle and weather with equal skill. Tom was newer, but he was loyal and fearless, exactly the kind of man you wanted watching your back. This is a private matter, Aldrich snapped, clearly rattled by the sudden shift in odds. Nothing private about threatening our boss on his own land, Tom said cheerfully. That makes it ranch business. The scarred gunman's hand moved closer to his weapon, but Miguel's shotgun swung to cover him with lazy precision. I wouldn't, Miguel said softly. This old gun, she has a wide spread. Be ashamed to redecorate the yard. The tension ratcheted up another notch. James could feel the moment balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one nervous twitch, and blood would be spilled on his land. Enough, he said, his voice cutting through the standoff like a whip. Covington, you've heard the lady's answer. I suggest you and your men mount up and ride out. This isn't over, Aldrich snarled. There are other ways to handle this situation. Legal ways. I have connections. Influence. So do I, James interrupted. Senator Morrison from Montana is a personal friend, as is Judge Harrison in Cheyenne. Funny thing about territorial judges, they don't much like it when Eastern tenderfoots come west and start throwing their weight around. It was a bluff. James barely knew Senator Morrison and had never met Judge Harrison, but Aldrich didn't know that. You're making a mistake, Blackwood. All of you. I have resources you can't imagine. Maybe, James acknowledged, but you're a long way from those resources right now. This is Wyoming Territory, Covington. Out here, the only law that matters is the one you can enforce yourself. For a moment, he thought Aldrich might actually call his bluff. The man's pale eyes darted between the armed ranch hands, calculating odds and angles. Then Catherine stepped forward, and her voice carried the unmistakable ring of absolute certainty. Aldrich, let me make something perfectly clear. I would rather die in this place I've chosen than live one day as your wife. If you try to take me by force, you'll have to kill me first. And if you kill me, you get nothing. No political advancement, no social connections, no heirs to carry on your name. Just a dead woman and a hangman's noose. The naked honesty in her words hit like a physical blow. James saw Aldrich flinch as if she'd slapped him. You don't mean that. I've never meant anything more in my life. Another long silence. Then Aldrich jerked his head toward his men. Mount up, he ordered tersely. We're leaving. Just like that? The scarred gunman asked. Just like that. Aldrich swung into his saddle with jerky, angry movements. For now. He wheeled his horse around, then paused to look back at Catherine. This isn't finished, Catherine. You think you've won, but you don't understand the forces you are playing with. I'll be back. No, Catherine said quietly. You won't. Something in her tone made Aldrich's face go pale. Without another word, he spurred his horse and led his men at a gallop toward the eastern horizon. James watched until they were dots in the distance, then turned to his men. Miguel, Tom, thank you. Keep an eye out for the next few days, just in case they decide to try something stupid. Sí, patron, Miguel nodded. We watch good. After the men dispersed, James turned to Catherine, who was still standing tall and proud, despite the tremor in her hands as she tucked the derringer back into her pocket. "Where did you get that gun?" he asked. "I've had it since I left Philadelphia. My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Said a woman should know how to protect herself." Smart man. In some ways, she finally allowed her rigid posture to relax slightly. "James, what I said before they arrived, I remember. Did you mean what you said about protecting me, married or not?" "Every word." She nodded slowly, then surprised him by stepping into his arms. "Then ask me again," she whispered against his chest. "Ask me properly this time. The most important decisions are made not with the mind, but with the heart." James pulled back just enough to see her face, his hands framing her cheeks with a gentleness that belied his calloused palms. The autumn sun was setting behind them, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set her hair on fire. "Catherine Elizabeth Whitmore," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "will you marry me? Not out of convenience or necessity, but because I love you more than I ever thought possible to love another human being." Her smile was radiant as sunrise. "Yes, James Blackwood. Yes, I'll marry you." He kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise, while his ranch hands whooped and hollered their approval from a respectful distance. "When?" he asked when they finally broke apart. "As soon as possible. I don't want to give Aldrich any more time to plan whatever he's plotting." "Tomorrow, then. I'll ride into town and fetch the preacher." But Catherine shook her head. "Tonight. Pastor Williams makes his monthly circuit through the territory. He's staying at the Morrison farm tonight, just 2 hours' ride from here. Miguel could fetch him while we prepare." "You want to get married tonight?" James couldn't keep the surprise out of his voice. "I've waited long enough to start my real life," Catherine said simply. "I don't want to wait another day." Something in her tone made him study her face more carefully. "Catherine, what did you mean when you told Aldrich he wouldn't be back? You sounded certain." Her smile faltered slightly. "Let's just say I know Aldrich better than he thinks I do. He's not as powerful as he pretends to be, and he's made some enemies back east who would be very interested to know where he is." "What kind of enemies?" "The kind who don't appreciate being cheated out of large sums of money." Catherine's expression grew hard. "Aldrich's political ambitions are built on a foundation of borrowed money and forged connections. It wouldn't take much to bring it all crashing down. And you know how to do that?" "I know who to contact. Letters are already en route to certain interested parties in Philadelphia and Washington." She touched his cheek gently. "By the time those letters arrive, Mr. Aldrich Covington will have much bigger problems than one runaway heiress." James felt a surge of admiration for the woman in his arms. She'd been planning this counterattack while playing the role of dutiful housekeeper, quietly gathering the weapons she needed to destroy her enemies. "Remind me never to get on your bad side," he said. "You're safe," she assured him. "I only destroy people who deserve it." 2 hours later, the main room of the Blackwood Ranch house had been transformed into something approaching a chapel. Catherine had somehow managed to find candles and wildflowers, creating an atmosphere of simple elegance that made the rough-hewn space feel sacred. Pastor Williams was a weathered man in his 60s who'd been bringing the Word of God to the frontier for most of his adult life. He'd seen enough of human nature to ask no awkward questions about the suddenness of the ceremony or the unusual circumstances surrounding it. "Marriage is a serious commitment," he said as they stood before him, "not to be entered into lightly or for purposes of convenience." "We understand, Pastor," James replied, never taking his eyes off Catherine's face. "Do you, James Blackwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do." The words came easily, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "And do you, Catherine Whitmore, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, until death do you part?" "I do." Her voice was clear and strong, free of any doubt. "The rings." James reached into his pocket and withdrew his mother's wedding band, a simple gold circle that had waited 15 years for the right woman to wear it. Catherine's eyes misted as he slipped it onto her finger, the fit so perfect it might have been made for her. In return, she offered him a gold signet ring that had belonged to her father. "It's not much," she said softly, "but it's all I have left of my family." "It's perfect," he assured her, feeling the weight of history as she placed it on his finger. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." James cupped Catherine's face in his hands and kissed her with all the love and hope and promise he couldn't find words for. Around them, the small gathering erupted in cheers. Miguel and Tom, the pastor, even the ranch cook who'd insisted on preparing a wedding supper despite the short notice. But James was only aware of Catherine, of the way she melted against him, of the rightness of holding her as his wife. "Mrs. Blackwood," he murmured against her lips. "I like the sound of that," she whispered back. Later, after the pastor had departed and the others had retreated to give the newlyweds privacy, James and Catherine sat together on the porch swing he'd built the previous summer. The night was clear and cold, the stars brilliant in the vast Wyoming sky. "No regrets?" he asked, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "None." Catherine leaned into his warmth, her head finding the perfect spot against his shoulder. "Though I should probably tell you the rest of my secrets before our wedding night." "There's more?" She laughed softly. "Nothing dramatic, just practical things. I can't actually cook very well. I've been winging it based on my governess's cookbook and hoping you wouldn't notice." "I noticed," James admitted. "Your biscuits could have been used as cannonballs the first week." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I could see you trying so hard to prove yourself. And because—" he paused, searching for the right words. "Because I was falling in love with your determination, not your domestic skills." "What else did you notice?" "That you read French poetry when you think no one's watching. That you know more about cattle breeding than most ranchers. That you sing opera when you're hanging laundry." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "That you're about 100 times too good for a broken-down ex-soldier like me." "James Blackwood." Catherine sat up to look at him directly. "You are the finest man I've ever known. You're honest and strong and gentle and brave, and you make me feel like I can be all of those things too." "You already are all of those things. Only because you see them in me." She traced the line of his jaw with gentle fingers. "For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I belong." "You are," he said, catching her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. "You're home, Catherine, for as long as you want to be." "Forever, then." Her smile was soft and certain. "I want to be home forever." As if summoned by her words, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of snow and pine and the promise of winter. But James felt nothing but warmth as he held his wife, and looked ahead to all the seasons they would share. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, he was certain. Ranching was never easy, and Catherine's past might not be as settled as they hoped. But tonight, with her in his arms and their future stretching out like the endless sky above them, James Blackwood was the richest man in the territory, and he intended to make sure Catherine never regretted choosing love over security, the frontier over civilization, him over the life she'd been born to live. The adventure was just beginning. Paradise never lasts as long as you hope it will. For 6 blissful weeks, James almost forgot that happiness could be dangerous. Catherine settled into her new role as his wife with the same determination she'd brought to everything else, transforming not just his house but his entire life. She hung curtains in the windows and planted herbs by the kitchen door. She reorganized his chaotic bookkeeping system and somehow managed to negotiate better prices with the suppliers in town. Most importantly, she filled the empty spaces in his soul with laughter and warmth and the kind of love he'd never dared to hope for. Their wedding night had been tentative and sweet, both of them nervous about crossing the line from friendship to intimacy. But Catherine approached marriage with the same courage she'd shown in everything else, and James discovered that loving her with his body was just as natural as loving her with his heart. The nights that followed were a revelation of passion and tenderness that left him marveling at his good fortune. The days were equally perfect. Catherine threw herself into learning the intricacies of ranch management, riding out with him to check the herds and asking thoughtful questions about breeding programs and grazing rotations. She charmed his workers with her genuine interest in their lives and their families, and she turned their evening meals into occasions of warmth and conversation that made even the most taciturn cowboy smile. "You're different," Miguel observed one morning as they worked together to repair a section of fence. "Happier. The Senora, she is good for you." James smiled, thinking of Catherine back at the house, probably reading one of his veterinary manuals while she planned the day's meals. "She's good for all of us." "See, but especially for you." Miguel's weathered face creased with something like paternal satisfaction. "You were turning into stone, Patron. Now you are a man again." It was true. James could feel the difference in himself, the way his shoulders didn't carry quite so much tension, the way he found reasons to smile instead of reasons to scowl. Catherine had given him back pieces of himself he'd thought were lost forever, which was why the smoke on the horizon filled him with such immediate, primal dread. He was in the south pasture when he saw it, a thick, black column rising against the perfect blue of the December sky. Too much smoke for a controlled burn, too dense for a chimney fire. Something big was burning. Something in the direction of his ranch house. James spurred his horse to a gallop, his heart hammering against his ribs as the smoke grew thicker and darker. Behind him he could hear Miguel and Tom thundering in pursuit, but he couldn't wait for them. All he could think about was Catherine, probably alone in the house, maybe trapped. The relief when he crested the final hill and saw the ranch house standing intact was so intense it made him dizzy. But his relief was short-lived, because the smoke wasn't coming from the house. It was coming from the barn. The magnificent structure he'd built with his own hands was engulfed in flames, orange tongues licking hungrily at the winter sky. The horses, Christ, the horses were still inside. James threw himself from his saddle and ran toward the inferno, but strong hands caught him before he could reach the doors. "No, Patron," Miguel shouted over the roar of the flames. "It's too late. The horses are safe." Catherine appeared at his side, her face streaked with soot and her dress singed from flying embers. "I got them out, all of them." James caught her in his arms, crushing her against his chest as relief flooded through him. "Thank God. Are you hurt?" "No, I'm fine, but James..." Her voice was tight with something that might have been fear. "This wasn't an accident." "What do you mean?" Instead of answering, she led him around to the side of the burning barn, pointing to something in the dirt that made his blood run cold. Hoof prints, fresh ones leading away from the barn toward the eastern hills. 3 sets of prints. "When did you first notice the fire?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "About 20 minutes ago. I was hanging laundry when I smelled smoke. By the time I got here, the whole back wall was already in flames." Catherine's hands were shaking now, either from shock or cold. "I barely had time to get the horses out before the roof started to collapse." James studied the burn pattern, the way the fire had spread. Miguel was right, it was too late to save the structure. But looking at the evidence, he could see that Catherine was right too. This had been deliberately set. "Found something, Patron," Tom called from the other side of the barn. James walked over to where the young cowboy was standing, Catherine close behind him. Tom was holding a partially burned piece of cloth, expensive wool, the kind that would be found in a gentleman's coat. "Could have caught on a nail when they was running," Tom suggested. James examined the fabric carefully. It was definitely quality material, far finer than anything his ranch hands would wear. The kind of cloth that might be found in an Eastern gentleman's riding coat. The kind Aldrich Covington had been wearing 6 weeks ago. "He came back," Catherine whispered, and there was no need to ask who she meant. "The coward waited until I was away from the house," James said, rage building in his chest like pressure in a steam boiler. "He could have killed you. That wasn't his intention." Catherine's voice was steady, but he could see the fear in her green eyes. "This was a message. He's letting us know he can reach us whenever he wants." "Well, he's about to get a message back." "James, no." Catherine caught his arm as he started toward his horse. "That's exactly what he wants, for you to ride off half-cocked and do something that will give him an excuse to involve the law." "The law?" James laughed bitterly. "What law? Sheriff Morrison is 3 days' ride from here, and by the time he arrives, Covington will be long gone." "That's not the point. Aldrich is trying to provoke you into doing something stupid, something that will discredit you or give him legal grounds to take me back east. Catherine stepped in front of him, blocking his path to his horse. Don't give him what he wants. James knew she was right, but the logical part of his brain was being drowned out by the primitive need to protect what was his. Someone had threatened his wife, destroyed his property, could have killed her if she'd been caught in the barn when it went up. The civilized response was to involve the authorities, to handle this through proper legal channels. The Wyoming response was to strap on his guns and settle this the way men had been settling things on the frontier since the first pioneers crossed the Missouri River. He's not going to stop, James said quietly. This was just the beginning. Next time it might be the house, or the cattle, or... He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice his worst fear. I know. Catherine's hand found his, squeezing gently. But we're smarter than he is, James. We can beat him without becoming the criminals he wants us to be. How? Before Catherine could answer, Miguel approached with something in his hands that made them all freeze. Found this nailed to the fence post by the gate, he said grimly. It was a note written in Aldrich's precise handwriting on expensive stationery. Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, I trust this demonstration has clarified the precarious nature of your situation. Mrs. Blackwood belongs in civilization, not in this wilderness where accidents occur so frequently. I am prepared to be reasonable. Dissolve your fraudulent marriage, and Mrs. Blackwood can return to Philadelphia with no further unpleasantness. Refuse, and I cannot guarantee the safety of your property or persons. You have 3 days to consider my generous offer. Respectfully, A. Covington. P.S. I do hope none of your livestock were harmed in today's unfortunate incident. James crumpled the note in his fist, his jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack. 3 days, he said. 3 days, Catherine agreed. But when she looked up at him, her green eyes were blazing with the same determination that had first drawn him to her. More than enough time to destroy him. Sometimes the only way to win a war is to change the battlefield entirely. Tell me about Aldrich's business dealings, James said that night, as they sat in his study, the acrid smell of smoke still clinging to their clothes despite changing and washing. Everything you know. Catherine curled deeper into the leather chair beside his desk, a cup of coffee warming her hands. The events of the day had shaken her more than she'd wanted to admit, but now that the initial shock had passed, he could see her mind working with the cold calculation of someone planning a counterattack. Aldrich Covington presents himself as a legitimate businessman with political aspirations, Chipien. In reality, he's built his entire fortune on a network of fraudulent investments and political favors. Explain. He takes money from wealthy investors, promising to fund railroad expansion and territorial development. Instead, he uses their money to buy influence with politicians and territorial officials, then manipulates land grants and contracts to benefit his fake projects. Catherine set down her coffee and moved to James's desk, pulling out paper and ink. Let me draw you a map of his operation. As she sketched, James found himself marveling once again at the sharp intelligence hidden behind her ladylike exterior. This was Catherine Whitmore in full, not the desperate fugitive or the dutiful housekeeper, but the educated daughter of a senator who'd grown up watching political chess games at the highest levels. Here's how it works, she said, marking different locations on a rough map. Aldrich identifies a territory or region ripe for development, somewhere like Wyoming, where land is cheap and oversight is minimal. He establishes contact with local officials, usually through a combination of bribes and promises of future political support. Men like who? In Wyoming, Territorial Governor Samuel Crawford, for one, Judge William Harrison in Cheyenne, several members of the territorial legislature. Catherine's expression darkened. Aldrich has been very busy since arriving here. James felt his blood chill. You think he's already bought them? I think he's trying to. The question is whether he's succeeded. Catherine added more details to her sketch. If he has, then any legal action we take will be useless. Worse than useless, it will give him the excuse he needs to have me arrested and extradited. And if he hasn't, then we have a narrow window to expose him before he can consolidate his position. James studied the map she'd drawn, following the lines of connection and influence. What kind of evidence would we need? Financial records mostly, correspondence between Aldrich and his co-conspirators, documentation of the fraudulent investments. Catherine met his eyes, the kind of evidence that would be very difficult to obtain legally, but not impossible to obtain. Not impossible, no. They stared at each other across the desk, the unspoken implications hanging between them like smoke. What Catherine was suggesting would require them to break several laws and take enormous risks. If they were caught, it would mean prison for both of them. If they did nothing, Aldrich would systematically destroy everything they'd built until Catherine had no choice but to surrender. Where would these records be kept? James asked finally. Aldrich is staying at the Grand Hotel in Cheyenne in the governor's suite. He's probably carrying the most sensitive documents with him, but he'll have backup copies hidden somewhere secure. Such as? A bank vault, a lawyer's office, maybe a safe deposit box under an assumed name. Catherine drummed her fingers on the desk, thinking. But there's another possibility. Which is? Aldrich never travels alone on business. He always brings his personal secretary, a nervous little man named Herbert Finch who handles all the paperwork and correspondence. Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. Herbert is also a gambling addict who's been embezzling small amounts from Aldrich's accounts for years. How do you know that? Because my father caught him at it and used the information to blackmail Aldrich into several favorable business deals. Herbert is desperate, greedy, and terrified of being exposed. Catherine leaned forward, her eyes bright with possibility. He's also exactly the kind of man who might be willing to sell his employer's secrets for the right price. James felt pieces clicking into place in his mind. You want to buy the evidence from this Herbert character. I want to offer him something better than money. I want to offer him freedom. Meaning? Herbert has enough evidence to destroy Aldrich completely. Not just his Wyoming operation, but his entire network stretching back to Philadelphia. If we can convince him to cooperate, we can end this permanently. And what makes you think he'll trust us instead of his current employer? Catherine's smile turned predatory. Because I have something Aldrich doesn't know about. Something Herbert wants more than money or security. She moved to the bookshelf and withdrew a slim volume, not one of James's books, but something she must have brought with her from the East. From between its pages, she extracted a folded document. This is a promissory note signed by Herbert Finch, acknowledging a debt of $8,000 to a gambling establishment in Philadelphia. It's also a confession of embezzlement, written in Herbert's own hand. Catherine handed the paper to James. My father kept it as insurance, but he died before he could use it. James read the document twice, whistling softly. This would be enough to send him to prison for 20 years. Or enough to set him free if he cooperates with us instead of Aldrich. You want to blackmail him. I want to offer him a choice. Continue serving Aldrich and eventually face exposure in prison, or help us destroy Aldrich and disappear with enough money to start over somewhere safe. James had to admit it was a good plan, risky as hell, but good. How do we contact this Herbert without alerting Aldrich? Leave that to me. I know Herbert's weaknesses, and I know where he'll be tomorrow night. Where? The poker game at Murphy's Saloon. Herbert never misses it when he's in Cheyenne, and Aldrich never accompanies him because he considers gambling beneath his dignity. You want to ride into Cheyenne and confront Herbert in a saloon? James shook his head. Too dangerous. If Aldrich's men are watching, they won't be watching Herbert. They'll be watching you, or watching the approaches to the ranch. They won't expect me to go hunting in the middle of Cheyenne. Catherine, this is our best chance, James, maybe our only chance. She moved around the desk to take his hands. I know it's dangerous, but doing nothing is more dangerous. Aldrich isn't going to stop with burning barns. Next time, people are going to get hurt. She was right, and James knew it. But the thought of Catherine riding into Cheyenne alone, walking into a saloon full of drunks and gamblers, and worse, made his protective instincts scream in protest. If you're going, I'm going with you. No, absolutely not. If Aldrich's men spot you in town, everything falls apart. Then we find another way. There is no other way. Catherine squeezed his hands, her green eyes pleading. Trust me, James. I can do this. James stared into his wife's face, seeing the determination there, the courage that had brought her across half a continent to escape a life she couldn't accept. She was right, she could do this. The question was whether he could let her. If anything goes wrong, he began, nothing will go wrong. If anything goes wrong, right, he continued firmly, you run. You don't try to be a hero. You don't try to save anyone else. You just run. Promise me. I promise. But even as she said the words, James could see the lie in her eyes. Catherine Blackwood wasn't the kind of woman who ran from a fight, and they both knew it, which meant he was about to spend the longest night of his life waiting to find out if the woman he loved was coming home or walking into a trap that would destroy them both. The hardest part of any battle is the waiting. Catherine left for Cheyenne at dawn, riding James's fastest horse and carrying a small fortune in gold coins sewn into the lining of her coat. She was dressed as a respectable ranch wife traveling to town for supplies, complete with a shopping list and a plausible story about needing to replace items lost in the barn fire. James watched her ride away until she was nothing but a speck on the horizon, then spent the rest of the day pacing his study like a caged wolf. She knows what she's doing, Patron, Miguel said when he found James standing at the window for the 100th time. The senora, she is stronger than she looks. Stronger than she should have to be, James muttered. Perhaps, but this is the frontier. Here, everyone must be strong or they do not survive. It was true, but it didn't make watching her ride into danger any easier. By evening, James had worn a path in the floor and consumed enough coffee to keep him awake for a week. Tom and Miguel had taken turns trying to distract him with ranch business, but nothing could quiet the voice in his head that whispered all the things that could go wrong. Catherine could be recognized despite her disguise. Herbert could refuse to cooperate. Aldrich could discover the meeting and turn it into a trap. Any of a dozen different failures could result in his wife being arrested, shot, or worse. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, James made a decision that went against every promise he'd made to Catherine. He was going after her. Miguel, saddle Thunder and pack my saddlebags with ammunition. I'm riding to Cheyenne. Si, patron, is probably wise. Probably foolish, James corrected, but I can't sit here doing nothing while she faces this alone. He was checking his weapons when the sound of approaching hoofbeats made him freeze. For a moment, hope flared in his chest. Catherine returning early with news of success. But the rhythm was wrong. Too many horses, moving too fast. James grabbed his rifle and stepped onto the porch, Miguel and Tom flanking him with their own weapons ready. The riders who emerged from the gathering darkness were not what any of them had expected. Sheriff Morrison led the group, his weathered face grim in the lamplight. Behind him rode 3 deputies and a man James didn't recognize. Someone in expensive clothes with the soft look of an Eastern lawyer. James, Sheriff Morrison said, touching his hat brim in greeting. Need to talk to you. Bit late for social calls, Sheriff. Ain't social. Morrison dismounted heavily, his joints creaking with the motion. This here's Mr. Warren Lynch, attorney for the territorial government. He's got some questions about your wife. The lawyer stepped forward, consulting a document in his hand. Mr. Blackwood, I have here a warrant for the arrest of one Catherine Elizabeth Whitmore, also known as Catherine Wells, also known as Catherine Blackwood, on charges of fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to defraud investors. James felt the world tilt sideways. On whose authority? Territorial Judge William Harrison, acting on evidence provided by Mr. Aldrich Covington and corroborated by several prominent businessmen. Evidence that's completely fabricated, James said flatly. That's for a court to decide. Where is your wife, Mr. Blackwood? Not here. Don't make this difficult, Sheriff Morrison said quietly. We both know she's been living here. Just tell us where she is and we'll take her in peaceful like. I told you she's not here. She rode to town this morning for supplies. What town? The lawyer pressed. Redemption Falls. We just came from Redemption Falls. She wasn't there. James kept his expression carefully neutral. Then she must have gone elsewhere. My wife doesn't always share her plans with me. Sheriff Morrison studied his face for a long moment. James, you're walking a fine line here. Harboring a fugitive is a serious offense. I'm not harboring anyone. I'm standing on my own land, talking to men who showed up uninvited after dark. James shifted his rifle slightly. Not quite threatening, but not quite peaceful either. Now, if you've got business with my wife, you're welcome to wait for her to return. Otherwise, I suggest you move along. We'll be watching the roads, the lawyer said coldly. If she tries to leave the territory, she'll be arrested. If she's innocent, she has nothing to fear from your courts. Innocent people don't run. No, James agreed, but smart people avoid corrupt judges and bought testimony. The lawyer's face darkened. Are you suggesting that Judge Harrison? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating it plainly. James stepped down from the porch, bringing himself closer to the mounted men. Aldrich Covington has been buying influence since the day he arrived in Wyoming. If Judge Harrison signed that warrant based on Covington's evidence, then Harrison's either corrupt or a fool. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious situation. Sheriff Morrison intervened before the conversation could escalate further. James, a word of advice from an old friend. If your wife is innocent, help her prove it through proper channels. Don't make this worse by fighting the law. And if the law's been bought and paid for, then God help us all. Morrison touched his hat again. We'll be watching, James. Don't do anything stupid. After they rode away, James stood in his yard for a long time, staring at the stars and thinking about options that were rapidly running out. Aldrich had moved faster than they'd anticipated. Instead of waiting 3 days, he'd spent the time since the barn fire setting legal traps that would make Catherine a fugitive, regardless of her guilt or innocence. The smart thing to do would be to contact Catherine, warn her about the warrant, and help her disappear completely. They could liquidate his assets, sell the ranch, and start over somewhere beyond the reach of territorial law. But Catherine wasn't the kind of woman who would run forever, and James wasn't the kind of man who would let injustice stand unchallenged, which left only one option. If Aldrich wanted to play dirty, James would show him exactly how dirty things could get on the Wyoming frontier. But first, he had to make sure his wife was safe. James saddled his horse and rode hard for Cheyenne, praying he wasn't already too late. The truth has a way of surfacing, like oil on water. You can try to hide it, but eventually it always rises to the top. James found Catherine at Murphy's saloon, not as the captured fugitive he'd feared, but as the victor in a negotiation that had exceeded even her own expectations. Herbert Finch sat across from her at a corner table, his nervous hands clutching a whiskey glass, while he listened to Catherine's calm, measured voice outline the terms of his redemption. On the table between them lay a leather portfolio thick with documents, evidence that would destroy Aldrich Covington and everyone connected to his schemes. Mrs. Blackwood, Herbert was saying as James approached, you have to understand, if Mr. Covington discovers what I've done, Mr. Covington will be in federal prison by Christmas, Catherine interrupted smoothly, along with Judge Harrison and Governor Crawford and anyone else stupid enough to take his money. The question is whether you'll be sharing a cell with them or starting a new life in California. James took the empty chair beside his wife, marveling at her composure. She showed no surprise at his appearance, as if she'd been expecting him all along. Problems? He asked quietly. Solutions, Catherine corrected. Mr. Finch has been very cooperative. Because I don't have a choice, Herbert said miserably. Show him the telegram. Catherine handed James a yellow Western Union form. It was addressed to Aldrich Covington and contained a single line. Package delivered, warrant issued. Subject now officially fugitive. Aldrich sent this yesterday, Catherine explained. Herbert intercepted it before delivery. James felt pieces clicking into place. He knew about the warrant before it was served. He orchestrated it. The evidence against me was fabricated months ago, held in reserve until Aldrich needed leverage. Catherine's smile was sharp as winter wind. Unfortunately for him, Herbert kept copies of everything, including the correspondence with Judge Harrison arranging the whole charade. Not just Harrison, Herbert added, pulling more documents from his portfolio. Governor Crawford, 3 territorial legislators, 2 federal marshals, and a circuit judge in Colorado. Aldrich has been building this network for 2 years. James whistled softly as he scanned the papers. This is enough to bring down half the territorial government. Which is exactly what we're going to do, Catherine said. Herbert has agreed to testify before a federal grand jury in exchange for immunity and relocation assistance. What about Aldrich? Where is he now? Herbert checked his pocket watch nervously. He's expecting me back at the hotel by 10 o'clock. When I don't show up, he shuddered. He'll know something's wrong. Let him know, Catherine said firmly. By morning, copies of these documents will be on their way to Washington, Denver, and San Francisco. Aldrich can run, but he can't hide from federal marshals. James studied his wife's face, seeing the satisfaction there, the sense of justice finally being served. But underneath, he caught a glimpse of something else. Exhaustion, perhaps, or relief that the long nightmare was finally ending. We should get back to the ranch, he said. There are things you need to know about Sheriff Morrison's visit. They left Herbert at the saloon with instructions to disappear until contacted by federal authorities. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts as they processed the magnitude of what Catherine had accomplished. How did you know it would work? James asked as they neared home. I didn't, Catherine admitted, but I knew Herbert was desperate enough to try anything. And I knew Aldrich well enough to predict how he'd react to being cornered. With violence. With stupidity. Aldrich's greatest weakness is his ego. He couldn't simply eliminate me quietly. He had to make it public. Had to prove his power by destroying me through legal channels. That arrogance is what gave us the evidence we needed. As they reached the ranch house, James could see lights burning in every window. Miguel and Tom keeping watch, ready for trouble. But the trouble, he realized, was over. Not just for tonight, but forever. 6 months later, James and Catherine stood on the porch of their rebuilt barn, watching the sun set over their expanded herds. The trials that had followed Aldrich's arrest had been a sensation in the territorial newspapers, exposing corruption that reached all the way to Washington and resulting in the resignation of Governor Crawford and the impeachment of Judge Harrison. Aldrich himself was serving 20 years in federal prison, his political career destroyed, and his fortune seized to compensate his victims. Herbert Finch had testified with devastating effect before disappearing into a new life somewhere in Oregon. Any regrets? James asked, his arm tightening around Catherine's waist. Only one, she said, leaning into his warmth. I regret that it took me so long to find you. Worth the wait, he assured her, pressing a kiss to her temple. Even with all the drama, the fires and threats and legal proceedings? Especially because of all that. It showed me what kind of woman I married. Someone strong enough to fight for what matters, brave enough to risk everything for love. Catherine turned in his arms, her green eyes bright with tears of happiness. We did it, didn't we? We actually won. We did more than win, James said, thinking of the ranch thriving around them, the workers who'd become family, the life they'd built together from ashes and determination. We found our happily ever after. As if summoned by his words, Miguel appeared from the direction of the corrals, his weathered face creased with the particular satisfaction of a man who'd just finished a job well done. Patron, Senor Amon, he called out. The new horses, they are settled good. Tomorrow we start training the colts, see? Tomorrow, James agreed. Tonight, we celebrate. And as the three of them walked toward the house where Tom was already lighting lanterns for the evening meal, James reflected on the strange turns that had brought him to this moment. He'd started the year as a lonely widower, convinced that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. He was ending it as a husband, a partner, a man who'd learned that love wasn't a luxury at all. It was the foundation upon which everything else worth having was built. Behind them, the rebuilt barn stood solid and proud against the darkening sky, a testament to resilience and second chances. And tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new reasons to be grateful for the woman who'd arrived on his doorstep claiming there had been no mistake. She'd been right about that, James thought as Catherine's laughter rang out across the ranch yard. There had been no mistake at all, only destiny, wearing the disguise of a desperate housekeeper who'd turned out to be the missing piece of his soul. If this story touched your heart and made you believe in second chances, I'd be incredibly grateful if you'd hit that subscribe button and share this tale with someone who needs to remember that love can bloom even in the harshest landscapes. Which part of Catherine and James's journey resonated most with you? I read every comment and love hearing your thoughts.